I knew a man once named Dr. Ford Ashley. He was a brilliant biochemist and my mentor for the better part of 3 years. When I met Dr. Ashley in June of 2005, he was a character to behold. He stood at 6 foot even and was as thin as a pencil. He had very pale skin and a very slight, consistent cough. He greeted me in his lab with a smile and a weak handshake before coughing into a white handkerchief that seemed to always be in his hand. By this point, I had completed most of my schooling and was looking for an expert to help hone my skills and start my own lab someday. Ford, as I had come to call him, was at first very introverted. He told me about the things he was getting paid to work on and taught me various techniques to make things faster and easier. It wasn't until November of 2005 that I started to learn more about him and his personal goals. Whenever there was free time in the lab, he would be searching for cures to various degenerative respiratory diseases. He was a visionary when it came to this, always knowing the outcome before asking the question, it seemed. Around the anniversary of when I started with Ford, I began to learn his true motivations. Up until this point, it seemed that Ford had spent nearly all of his time in the lab. I would sometimes leave late in the night and return early the next morning, only to find him still toiling away. He never seemed to need to sleep. It was July of 2006 when that slight cough got significantly worse, to the point that he began leaving red and black splotches on the handkerchief. I asked him about it one day, and he would only say that it was a bad cold or some other common ailment. I walked into the lab one morning in late July and noticed that Ford wasn't there. This had never happened before. I'd always either met him there or, more commonly, found him there working. I called his name and got no answer. I didn't think much of it, so I started getting ready for the day, checking the equipment and whatnot, when I noticed that the door next to his office was slightly ajar. I went to the door and called out for Ford once more. As I opened the door, I saw the crumpled form of Dr. Ashley lying on the floor, blood and black ooze pooling around his head. I rushed to him and propped him up in a chair, and thankfully he woke up. I asked what had happened, and he asked for a glass of water. I saw that I could get no further questions at this time, so I got him some water and went out to get us breakfast across the street. To my surprise, the day carried on as normal from there. When we were getting ready to lock up the lab that night, Ford explained the details of his condition. Since he was a kid, Ford was near constantly sick. Never anything major. He never went to the doctor. It was always just a slight, dull, ill feeling, as he described it. The most notable symptom was an ever so slight cough, near imperceptible if you weren't looking. Steadily, the ailment worsened. Not extremely, just taking more physical forms. When he was about 20, the cough became more prominent, and his skin became a sickly shade of pale. He said it felt like his bones became frailer as well, though he never got it tested. Those worsening conditions fueled Ford's interest in the medical field. He went to school for years, studying anything and everything he could. He went to doctors, though none of them saw anything specifically wrong with him. Dr. Ashley became cynical of the outside world, starting a life of seclusion and deciding that he would be the only one who could save himself. That was, I suppose, until he met me. After learning this, we both took some time off. We came back to the lab in August of 2006, though I suspect that Ford had been there all along. Very soon after we got back into the swing of things, Ford clued me in on his plan. What I'm about to tell you will sound like some nonsensical science fiction, but Ford somehow had made a working prototype. His plan was to counteract his body's weakness, which he found out was some sort of rapid cell decay, by absorbing the essence of living things. Ford rolled back his sleeves to show me how it was done. Tubes now ran like lines of veins down his arm. He took off his shirt to reveal that the tubes ran out of his back as they plunged into a sort of grinder-like device. The device could be handheld, and it had a large enough opening to fit a coconut. At first, Ford would leave it on his desk somewhere, and whenever he was feeling particularly ill, he would plug it in and feed it a houseplant or two. I was terrified of the machine for some reason. It somehow felt cold and distant, not just because it was an inanimate machine, but in a way that only a severely depraved human could feel cold and distant. A bit of time passed on like that, and I got used to it. It was now April 2007, and Ford seemed healthier than ever. He got rid of the handkerchief, and even started going for walks at the local park whenever he had a chance to get away from the lab. He seemed happy for a change. Then, all of a sudden, his condition rapidly started to deteriorate. He ended up worse than he had started, skin beginning to dry up in patches and fall off completely. He was coughing near constantly, and half the time blood was coming up. He could barely stand. Here's where I did the first of a few terrible things to come. Ford collapsed once again and his breathing was ragged. I could tell he would die if I didn't do something soon. I plunged him into the machine and threw some plants into it, but it did nothing. My mind raced, and all of a sudden, my feet carried me over to the lab and down the hall. There was another lab that tested beauty products in the small building. I went to that lab and grabbed a rat. I don't know how I did exactly what I did next, but I threw the rat into the jaws of that awful machine. Ford perked up a moment later, thanking me profusely, then consoling me. He said it was a necessary evil, and at the time, I believed him. We got back to work for a few days when, for the first time ever, Dr. Ashley actually wasn't there. I searched around for him, but I didn't see him. Everything was locked up properly, and I noticed that the machine was gone. Ford didn't show up all day, but I got a decent amount of work done regardless. The next day, Ford apologized for his absence and said he had a family emergency he had to tend to. I didn't think anything of it. Midway through the day, Ford asked if I wanted to go on a walk in the local park. He said he'd found a pretty spot overlooking a large field. I told him I would, though we'd probably be gone for the rest of the day, as the park was a very large nature preserve. Ford was adamant and said we could take the rest of the day off. So off we went into the woods of the park and began to climb up a mountain. I hadn't had too much time to explore this place as a kid, so I was following every twist and turn as Ford took them. It started to get late when I noticed that Ford wasn't carrying the machine. I don't know how I hadn't noticed this, but I assumed it was at his house or something. Slowly, day becoming night, just as we got to the mouth of a cave, I had a very uneasy feeling at this point. But Ford somehow convinced me that if we were lost, we could spend the night in the cave. It was a fairly tight squeeze to get in, the entrance maybe 3 feet tall, and it was decently well hidden behind hanging moss. I wondered how Ford had been able to spot this. The mouth of the cave looked unstable, like any sudden force or any sort of weight behind it could collapse the whole thing. My eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, and I saw horrors I couldn't believe. I saw bloodied and torn up bones, hunks of flesh and blood splattered everywhere, and handprints on the wall. I tried to let out a scream, but my mouth wouldn't open. "Why are you so scared?" a crazed voice echoed through the darkness. "Can't you see? This is progress. You helped me make everything I ever wanted. This is all because of you." I ran for the exit as I heard and saw the machine hum to life. I looked back to find Ford already upon me. I managed to dodge out of the way enough so that his attack only grazed my leg. But he still managed to saw a chunk of meat clean off the leg. I pushed and punched at him, maybe a few times. It's hard to remember, but I managed to make some distance. I sprinted for the cave entrance and jumped out into the cold night air. I slammed at the entrance to the cave as I heard the whirring of gears come closer at a rapid pace. Finally, the rocks began to fall, sealing off the cave with piles and piles of loose earth. The device that Ford had wielded shifted from a brilliant man's magnum opus, his font of life, to a hungering steel maw devoid of any emotion. I don't know for sure how many people he had killed. Ford had been overtaken by lunacy. He had become nothing more than an animal whose only goal was survival. I sometimes pity the man to this day, even after all he did, as he didn't fail in the end. The maw became too hungry, and when I unsealed the cave I had trapped him in for days, the machine had eaten most of his body. It was either wholly gone or shredded beyond recognition. No one knew who Dr. Ashley was or that he had even died. At least until now, I suppose. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. If you enjoyed tonight's story, why not go ahead and subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky stuff we do here. If you'd like to get a copy of my latest book, there's a link below. Or if you'd like to support the show more monetarily, you can always come down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find something that interests you. If you're interested in my books, I always recommend my Ghostly Reader tier. Ghostly readers get a copy of my book signed on their doorstep anytime I write one, which is at least twice a year. Patrons always get their spooky a little bit early so they can enjoy them before that night's premiere. And speaking of patrons, let's go ahead and thank them. Thanks to Janet and Winters for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors. And thanks to Xaronana, Emily Coltsfoot, Martha, Marianne Schuler, Jennifer Damron, and Tyler Parker for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, guys. We just couldn't do the show without you. I'm sure by now you can see some videos appearing at the end here. If you think you might like a little more spooky, why not go ahead and click on another one? I'm sure you can handle a little bit more. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.